Humble 8-year-old girl pays for lunch for a man who lost his wallet, not knowing he was a millionaire, grieving the loss of his daughter 3 weeks ago. Before we begin, tell me something about where you live. What's the weather like today? The rain hammered against the windows of Murphy's diner like angry fists, each drop echoing the storm brewing in Robert Harrison's chest. 3 weeks, 21 days since the phone call that shattered his world. 21 days since little Sarah's laughter had been silenced forever by a drunk driver's reckless moment. Robert sat in the corner booth, his expensive suit soaked through, his silver hair disheveled. The untouched coffee grew cold as he stared at the small pink bracelet in his trembling hands, the last gift he'd bought for his 8-year-old daughter. The same age as, "Mister, are you okay?" The small voice pierced through his fog of grief. Robert looked up to see a tiny girl with mousy brown hair tied in a simple ponytail, her clothes worn but clean, her sneakers held together with duct tape. She couldn't have been older than 8, the same age Sarah would have been forever. Robert's voice cracked. He couldn't finish the lie. "You look really sad," the girl said, sliding into the booth across from him without invitation. "My mama says when people look that sad, they need a friend." "Emma," a tired voice called from across the diner, "leave the gentleman alone, sweetheart." Robert watched as a thin woman in a waitress uniform approached, exhaustion etched in every line of her face. She looked barely 30, but life had aged her beyond her years. "I'm so sorry, sir," the woman said, reaching for the little girl's hand. "Emma, we talked about this." "It's all right," Robert managed, surprised by his own words. Something about the child's earnest concern touched a place in his heart he thought had died with Sarah. Emma studied him with wise eyes that seemed too old for her face. "Are you hungry? Food makes everything a little better. That's what Mama always says." Robert glanced at the menu, realizing he hadn't eaten in days. "I suppose I could—" He reached for his wallet, patting his jacket pockets. Nothing. He checked his pants, his coat. Gone. My wallet. The panic in his voice was real. Not because Robert Harrison, CEO of Harrison Industries, couldn't afford a meal. His assets were worth over $200 million. But because in this moment, in this grief-stricken state, the simple act of losing his wallet felt like the final straw. "I'll pay for your lunch, mister," Emma announced, digging into her small pocket and producing a crumpled $5 bill and some quarters. "This is my allowance money, but Mama says helping people is more important than buying things for yourself." "Emma, no," her mother whispered urgently. "That's for your school supplies. It's okay, Mama. He needs it more than I need new crayons." Robert stared at the money in the child's small palm, probably all she had in the world, and felt something crack inside his chest. This little girl, who clearly had so little, was offering everything to a complete stranger. "I can't take your money, sweetheart," he whispered. "Please," Emma insisted, her eyes bright with determination. "My daddy went to heaven when I was 5, and I remember how sad Mama was. Nobody should eat alone when they're that sad." The simple words hit Robert like a physical blow. He watched as Emma slid the money across the table, her small fingers, gentle but insistent. In that moment, this child, this beautiful, generous soul, reminded him so much of Sarah that he could barely breathe. "Order whatever you want," Emma said with a smile that could have powered the entire diner. "I'll sit with you so you're not alone." As Robert looked into those kind eyes, he made a silent promise. He would find out everything about this little angel and her struggling mother. He would discover their story, their needs, their dreams, and somehow, some way, he would repay this incredible act of kindness. But first, he had to survive this meal without breaking down completely, because something told him that meeting Emma would change everything, though he had no idea that the little girl sitting across from him would soon become the reason he found his way back to living again. The waitress approached with her order pad, And Emma confidently declared, "He'll have the meatloaf special, please, and maybe some pie. Everybody needs pie when they're sad." Robert nodded, unable to speak, as he realized he'd just encountered the most extraordinary person he'd ever met. And she was only 8 years old. Robert watched through the rain-streaked window as Emma skipped beside her mother down Maple Street, her small hand clutching Grace's worn fingers. Something compelled him to follow at a distance, his heart pounding with a mixture of curiosity and desperate need to understand this family that had touched his soul. They turned into Sunset Trailer Park, a collection of weathered mobile homes, where hope seemed as scarce as the peeling paint on the fences. Emma's home was number 47, a small aluminum box with a crooked porch and flower boxes that somehow bloomed despite the odds. Robert parked his Mercedes behind a cluster of oak trees, feeling like an intruder in his $1,000 suit. Through their thin walls, he could hear Emma's animated voice telling her mother about the sad man at the diner. "You gave him your allowance money." Grace's voice carried exhaustion and gentle reprimand. "He needed it more, Mama. His eyes looked just like yours did when Daddy died." Robert's breath caught. The innocent wisdom of this child was staggering. He watched as lights flickered on in their modest home, casting warm shadows against the curtains. This was real life, struggle, sacrifice, and the kind of love that money couldn't buy. His phone buzzed. Margaret, his assistant, with urgent messages about board meetings and quarterly reports. The corporate world that had consumed his life for decades suddenly felt hollow and meaningless. Nothing seemed important anymore except the glowing windows of Trailer 47. As he sat in his luxury car, Robert made a decision that would have shocked his business partners. He would learn everything about Emma and Grace. He would find a way to help them without destroying the beautiful simplicity of what they had. But most importantly, he would let them teach him how to live again. The next morning, he would begin his quiet investigation, and Emma, bless her innocent heart, had no idea that her $5 act of kindness had just caught the attention of one of the most powerful men in the state. But power, Robert was beginning to realize, meant nothing if you had no one to share it with. Grace Martinez wiped down the last table at Murphy's Diner, her feet aching from the double shift. Emma sat in the corner booth doing homework, her tongue poking out in concentration as she worked on math problems by the light of her small flashlight. The bulb above their usual table had burned out weeks ago. "Mama, why was that man so sad?" "Yesterday?" Emma asked, without looking up from her addition problems. Grace paused, remembering the well-dressed stranger who'd seemed on the verge of collapse. "Sometimes grown-ups carry heavy things in their hearts, sweetheart, just like you carried Daddy's picture for a long time after he went to heaven." "I still carry it," Emma whispered, pulling a worn photograph from her backpack. "But it doesn't hurt as much anymore." Grace's heart clenched. 3 years since David's construction accident, and she was still drowning in medical debt from his final months in the hospital. The bills kept coming, relentless as the tide. $60,000 might as well have been 60 million. She glanced at the envelope tucked behind the register, another past due notice from Memorial Hospital. Emma's last dental checkup had revealed cavities they couldn't afford to fill. The child never complained, never asked for the toys other kids had, never mentioned the holes in her shoes. "Mrs. Martinez?" A voice interrupted her thoughts. The diner's owner, Mr. Murphy, emerged from the kitchen with an envelope. "This came for you today. Strange thing. No return address, but it's definitely for you." Grace frowned, tearing open the envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for $500 and a simple note for Emma's school supplies and whatever else she needs. A grateful friend. Who would? Grace stared at the check, her hands trembling. $500 would cover Emma's dental work and still leave money for winter clothes. "Maybe you have a guardian angel," Mr. Murphy suggested with a smile. Grace looked at Emma, still absorbed in her homework, humming softly to herself. Yesterday, her daughter had given away her entire allowance to help a stranger. Today, somehow, kindness had found its way back to them. But who was watching? Who knew about their struggles? And why did the expensive stationery and perfect handwriting make her both grateful and nervous? Robert stood in Sarah's bedroom, untouched since the accident, and for the first time in 3 weeks he wasn't drowning in despair. Emma's face kept appearing in his mind, her earnest concern, her generous spirit, her unshakable belief that kindness mattered. Sarah's dollhouse sat in the corner, an elaborate Victorian mansion that had cost more than most people's cars. Yet Emma, with her duct-taped shoes and $5 allowance, possessed something infinitely more valuable than anything money could buy. "Sir," Margaret appeared in the doorway, her expression cautious. "The Henderson contract needs your signature, and the board is asking about the Morrison acquisition." Robert barely glanced at the papers. "Handle it. All of it." "Sir, you haven't been to the office in 3 weeks. The investors are—" "Margaret," Robert's voice was quiet but firm, "I want you to research everything about Grace Martinez. She works at Murphy's Diner on Maple Street. Quietly, carefully. I need to know about her situation, her debts, her daughter's needs. Everything." Margaret's eyebrows rose. This was not the Robert Harrison she'd worked for during the past 15 years. "Sir, may I ask—" "No questions, just information. And Margaret, set up a scholarship fund, anonymous, for children who demonstrate exceptional kindness. Start with 50,000. That evening, Robert drove back to Sunset Trailer Park. He sat in his car, watching Emma play on the small swing set behind their trailer. Her laughter carried on the evening breeze, pure and joyful despite her circumstances. A memory surfaced. Sarah on her elaborate swing set in their mansion's backyard, crying because she had no one to play with. The irony was devastating. His daughter had died surrounded by luxury, but starved for simple human connection. Emma, with nothing, seemed to have everything that mattered. Robert pulled out his phone and called his lawyer. "James, I want to change my will. Yes, all of it. And I need you to establish several trusts, anonymous ones." As he watched Emma's silhouette against the sunset, Robert felt something he hadn't experienced since the accident. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, this little girl could teach him how to honor Sarah's memory by actually living again. "Table 6 is asking for you specifically," Mr. Murphy told Grace, nodding toward the well-dressed man sitting alone by the window. Grace's heart skipped. It was him, the stranger Emma had helped 3 days ago. He looked different now. Less broken, though sadness still lingered in his eyes. "Ma'am," he stood as she approached, his manners old-fashioned and respectful. "I wanted to thank you. Your daughter. She showed me something I'd forgotten existed." "Emma has that effect on people," Grace smiled, refilling his coffee cup. "She sees the world differently than most of us." "I'm Robert," he said quietly, "and I was wondering, would it be appropriate for me to make a donation to Emma's school? Anonymous, of course. Call it paying forward her kindness." Grace studied his face. There was genuine warmth there, but also something deeper, a careful intentionality that made her slightly uneasy. "That's very generous, Mr. Just Robert. I lost someone recently, someone very precious. Your daughter reminded me that kindness still exists in this world." "I'm sorry for your loss," Grace said softly. "Emma lost her father 3 years ago. She understands that kind of pain." Robert's eyes widened. "I didn't know. How do you manage it? The grief, I mean." Grace glanced across the diner where Emma sat reading a library book, her legs swinging from the booth. "You don't manage it. You learn to carry it. Emma taught me that helping others helps heal the hurt. It's like sharing the weight makes it bearable." "She's remarkable," Robert whispered. She is, and she's all I have left of her father, his kindness, his generous heart. It lives on in her. Robert nodded, understanding flooding his features. The donation would be gratefully accepted, Grace said. But Robert, if you ever want to just talk about loss or about life, you're welcome here. Emma would love to see you again. As Robert left that afternoon, he felt something shift inside his chest. Grace's invitation wasn't just politeness, it was genuine human connection, something he'd forgotten how to build. But he also saw the careful way Grace stretched the coffee, the patches on Emma's backpack, the calculations she did on napkins when she thought no one was looking. Tomorrow, he would begin the delicate process of changing their lives without destroying the beautiful relationship that was slowly healing his broken heart. The call came at 2:17 a.m. Grace's panicked voice over the phone made Robert's blood run cold. "Robert, I'm sorry to call so late, but I didn't know who else. Emma's in the emergency room, high fever, and they're talking about pneumonia and my insurance. It doesn't cover everything and I can't." Robert was already reaching for his keys. "Which hospital?" "Memorial, but you don't have to. I'll be right there." Robert Harrison, who commanded boardrooms and controlled millions, had never felt more powerless than when he walked into Memorial. Hospital's pediatric wing. Grace sat in a plastic chair, still wearing her diner uniform, clutching Emma's backpack like a lifeline. "How is she?" he asked, sitting beside Grace. "Stable. The antibiotics are working, but they want to keep her for observation. 3 days minimum." Grace's voice broke. "I can't afford 3 days. I can barely afford 3 hours." "Yes, you can," Robert said quietly. Grace looked at him with confusion. "I mean, let me help, please. Emma saved my life that day in the diner. This is the least I can do." Before Grace could protest, Robert was at the billing desk, speaking in low, urgent tones with the night administrator. He returned with a gentle smile. "It's handled. Everything. Focus on Emma." "Robert, I can't let you—" "A very wise 8-year-old once told me that helping people is more important than keeping money for yourself." His eyes were bright with unshed tears. "She's teaching us both about what really matters." Through the window of Emma's room, they watched the little girl sleep, her breathing steady and peaceful. In the fluorescent hospital light, Robert saw something that made his heart race with both terror and joy. He was falling in love with this family. Not romantic love, something deeper. The love of someone who'd found his missing pieces in the most unexpected place. But as he watched Grace's grateful tears, Robert realized his secret was becoming a problem. How long could he hide who he really was? And what would happen when Grace discovered that the kind stranger was actually Robert Harrison, the same man whose company's development project was threatening to demolish Sunset Trailer Park in 6 months. Everything was about to get much more complicated. Emma's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. Within 48 hours, her fever broke, and by the 3rd day, she was sitting up in bed, coloring pictures for the nurses and charming every doctor who walked by. But for Robert, each moment of Emma's improvement only deepened his internal torment. "Look, Robert." Emma held up a crayon drawing of 3 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. "It's you, me, and Mama. We're a family now, right?" Robert's heart shattered and soared simultaneously. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. The doctor says I can go home today," Emma continued, her eyes bright with excitement. "And Mama says you can come have dinner with us, real dinner, at our house." Grace appeared in the doorway, carrying Emma's discharge papers and a small suitcase. "Only if Robert wants to, baby. He's probably very busy." "I'd love to," Robert said quickly, then caught himself. How could he sit at their dinner table, knowing what he knew? How could he look Grace in the eye while his company prepared to destroy their home? That morning, while Grace filled out paperwork, Robert had made a desperate phone call to his head of development. "Stop the Sunset Project," he demanded. "Sir, we're already 6 months into planning. The investors have committed $40 million. We can't just find another location, buy them out. I don't care what it costs. Mr. Harrison, with respect, the profit margins on this project are essential for our quarterly projections. The board will never—" Robert had hung up, his hands shaking. 15 years of building Harrison Industries into a powerhouse, and now his own success was threatening the only thing that mattered anymore. As they drove to Sunset Trailer Park in separate cars, Robert's Mercedes felt like a prison. Every luxury detail seemed to mock him. The leather seats that cost more than Grace made in 3 months, the sound system worth more than Emma's medical bills, the dashboard that displayed stock prices in real time. Emma's trailer looked different in daylight. Smaller, more fragile, but somehow warmer than his empty mansion. Grace had clearly spent the morning cleaning and preparing, though she couldn't hide the water stain on the ceiling or the way the floorboards creaked under their feet. "Welcome to our home," Grace said with genuine pride, her arms sweeping to encompass their modest living space. "It's not much, but it's ours." The simple statement hit Robert like a physical blow. This was their sanctuary, their safe harbor, their everything. And he was the storm that would destroy it all. Emma bounced excitedly around the small space, showing Robert her treasure box, an old shoebox filled with smooth stones and pretty leaves, her bookshelf, milk crates stacked against the wall, and her art studio, a card table by the window where she created masterpieces with dollar store supplies. "This is where I drew your picture that first day," Emma announced, pointing to her little workspace. "I could tell you needed someone to remember you were special." Grace's smile was radiant as she watched her daughter's joy. Emma has always been able to see the good in people, even when they can't see it themselves. Dinner was simple: spaghetti, with marinara sauce, garlic bread, and a salad made with vegetables from Grace's small garden behind the trailer. But the love that seasoned every bite made it the finest meal Robert had ever tasted. "Tell us about your little girl," Grace said, gently as they cleared the table. "Emma mentioned you seemed sad about someone special." Robert's fork paused mid-air. He'd been dreading this moment. But somehow Grace's gentle question opened a floodgate he'd kept sealed for weeks. "Her name was Sarah," he whispered. "She was 8, just like Emma, bright, curious, full of life. A drunk driver took her from me 3 weeks ago." Emma climbed into Robert's lap without asking, her small arms wrapping around his neck. "I'm sorry your Sarah went to heaven," she whispered, "but I bet she's happy you found us." The innocent words broke something loose in Robert's chest. He held Emma close, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo, feeling her heartbeat against his. This child had given him something he thought he'd lost forever: the ability to love without reservation. But as the evening wore on, Robert's guilt grew heavier. Every laugh, every story, every moment of connection felt like a betrayal of the secret he carried. He was living a lie, building a relationship on a foundation that would crumble the moment Grace learned the truth. When it was time to leave, Emma hugged him tightly. "You'll come back soon, right? Promise?" "I promise," Robert said, meaning it with every fiber of his being. But as he drove away from Sunset Trailer Park, he knew that keeping that promise might require him to sacrifice everything he'd spent his life building. The question was he brave enough to choose love over legacy? The Harrison Industries boardroom had witnessed many heated discussions over the years, but nothing like the confrontation that erupted on Thursday morning. Robert sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, facing 12 of the most powerful executives in the state, all staring at him as if he'd lost his mind. "You want to cancel the Sunset development?" Board member Charles Whitfield's voice dripped with disbelief. "Robert, this project represents our biggest expansion opportunity in 5 years." "Find another location," Robert said firmly, his hands steady despite the chaos raging inside him. "There is no other location." Margaret. Jen, the development director, spread blueprints across the table. "We've spent 18 months identifying this site. The proximity to downtown, the transportation access, the zoning approvals we've already secured. It's irreplaceable." Robert studied the plans that would transform Sunset Trailer Park into Harrison luxury condominiums. 47 families would be displaced, their communities scattered to make way for million-dollar units that most of them couldn't afford to clean, let alone live in. Trailer 47 was marked with a small red X. "What's this really about?" asked Victoria Sterling, the longest-serving board member. "Robert, you haven't been yourself since the accident. We understand you're grieving, but—" "This isn't about Sarah," Robert lied, though everything was about Sarah now, about Emma, about the family that had taught him what wealth really meant. "The investors have already committed," Charles continued, $42 million. "If we back out now, Harrison Industries will face lawsuits that could bankrupt us." "Then we'll face them," Robert said quietly. The room erupted. Voices overlapped in a crescendo of outrage and disbelief. These people had trusted him to make profitable decisions, not emotional ones. They had families, too, retirement funds tied to the company's success, careers built on Harrison Industries' reputation. Robert's phone buzzed with a text from Grace. "Emma keeps asking when you're coming back. Dinner Sunday?" His heart clenched. Sunday. 3 days from now. By then, would he have found a solution, or would he be forced to choose between his company and his soul? "Give me 2 weeks," Robert said suddenly, his voice cutting through the arguments. The room fell silent. 2 weeks to find an alternative that satisfies our investors and preserves the profit margins. "If I can't find a solution that works for everyone, we proceed as planned," Victoria started. 2 weeks, he repeated. "That's my final offer." As the executives filed out, grumbling and exchanging worried glances, Robert remained alone. With the blueprints, 47 red X's stared back at him. 47 families who had no idea their world was about to change. That evening, Robert drove to every rival development site within 50 miles. He met with city planners, zoning commissioners, and property owners. He called in favors, offered incentives, and explored options that would have seemed financially insane just weeks ago. Nothing came close to matching the Sunset location's advantages. By Friday night, Robert found himself sitting in his empty mansion, surrounded by luxury that felt more like a museum than a home. Sarah's piano sat silent in the corner, her music book still open to the last song she'd been learning. He pulled out his phone and called Grace. "Robert, is everything okay? You sound stressed." "Just work complications," he said, which was technically true. "Grace, can I ask you something? If you had to move from Sunset Trailer Park, where would you go?" There was a long pause. "Why would I have to move?" Robert's stomach knotted. "Hypothetically, if circumstances changed." I don't know." Grace said slowly. "Robert, what's wrong? You're scaring me." "Nothing's wrong," he lied. "I was just curious about your long-term plans." After they hung up, Robert sat in the darkness, staring at the photograph of Sarah on his desk. His daughter smiled back at him, frozen forever at 8 years old, the same age as the little girl who was changing his life. "What would you do?" "Sweetheart," he whispered to the picture, "how do I choose between doing what's right and protecting what I've built?" But Sarah couldn't answer, and Robert was running out of time. In 9 days, he would either have to find a miracle or watch Emma's world crumble while pretending he had nothing to do with it. The weight of his secret was becoming unbearable. Grace noticed the change in Robert immediately when he arrived for Sunday dinner. His smile was forced, his conversation stilted, and his eyes kept drifting to the windows as if he were calculating something she couldn't understand. "You're not eating," Emma observed, poking at her own plate of meatloaf. "Mama says when grown-ups don't eat, they're worried about something big." "I'm fine, sweetheart," Robert assured her, but Grace caught the tremor in his voice. After dinner, while Emma played with her dolls in the living room, Grace and Robert sat on the small back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. "Talk to me," Grace said quietly, "and don't say everything's fine. I've been a single mother for 3 years. I know when someone's carrying a heavy burden." Robert was quiet for so long that Grace wondered if he'd heard her. Finally, he spoke. "Grace, if someone you cared about was keeping a secret from you, something that might hurt you, but telling the truth could destroy everything good between you, what would you want them to do?" The question sent a chill down Grace's spine. "Robert, what kind of secret, hypothetically?" "No," Grace turned to face him fully, "not hypothetically. Real talk. What aren't you telling me?" Robert's hands clenched in his lap. "I can't. Not yet. I'm trying to fix something first." "Fix what?" Grace's maternal instincts were screaming. "Robert, does this have to do with Emma, with us?" Before Robert could answer, Emma burst through the screen door, chattering excitedly about a notice she'd found in the mailbox. "Mama, look, there's going to be a big meeting at the community center. All the grown-ups have to come Tuesday night." Emma held up an official-looking letter with the Harrison Industries letterhead. Grace's blood turned to ice as she read the notice. "Community information session regarding the Sunset Trailer Park development project." The words swam before her eyes as the implications hit her like a sledgehammer. "They're going to tear down our home?" Emma's voice was small and confused. "But why? We like it here." Grace looked at Robert, whose face had gone completely white. "You knew," she whispered. "You knew about this." "Grace, how long?" Her voice was deadly calm. "How long have you known they were planning to destroy our home?" Robert couldn't meet her eyes. "Grace, please, let me explain." "How long?" Grace's voice rose, and Emma moved closer to her mother, sensing the sudden tension. "Since before we met," Robert whispered. The admission hung in the air like a poison cloud. Grace stared at him, her mind racing to process this betrayal. The man she'd trusted, the man Emma had grown to love, had been lying to them from the very beginning. "Get out," she said quietly. "Grace, please, get out!" Grace's voice cracked like a whip. "Get out of my home and don't come back!" Emma started to cry, confused by the sudden anger. "Mama, why are you yelling at Robert?" "Because Robert isn't who we thought he was, baby," Grace said, her own tears starting to fall. "Sometimes people pretend to be good when they're really not." Robert stood slowly, his face devastated. "Emma, I want you to know that every moment we've spent together has been real. My feelings for you and your mother, those are real." "Just go," Grace said, turning away. "Before I say something I'll regret in front of Emma." As Robert's Mercedes pulled away from Sunset Trailer Park, Grace held her sobbing daughter and stared at the notice that would change their lives forever. Tuesday night, they would learn the details of their displacement. They would discover how much time they had, where they could go, what compensation they might receive. But the betrayal that hurt most wasn't corporate. It was personal. The man who had become Emma's father figure, who had made Grace believe in love again, who had paid for Emma's medical bills and brought joy back into their lives, had been lying to them all along. Emma cried herself to sleep that night, asking over and over why Robert had to go away. Grace sat beside her daughter's bed, stroking her hair and wondering how she would explain that sometimes the people who seem like angels are actually the ones who break your heart. Outside, storm clouds gathered, and Grace couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Sunset Trailer Park Community Center had never held so many people. 47 families crowded into the small space, their faces ranging from confused to angry to resigned. Grace sat in the back row with Emma, who clutched her stuffed rabbit and kept looking around for Robert. "Where's Robert, Mama? He promised he'd never leave us." "Hush, baby," Grace whispered, though her own heart was breaking. Sometimes people make promises they can't keep. At the front of the room, a woman in an expensive suit spread blueprints across a folding table. "Good evening, everyone. I'm Margaret Chen, Development Director for Harrison Industries. I'm here to discuss the Sunset Redevelopment Project." Grace's attention sharpened. Harrison Industries. Where had she heard that name before? As you know from the notices, Harrison Industries has purchased this land for a luxury condominium development. Construction will begin in 60 days, which means all current residents will need to relocate by March 1st. An elderly man in the front row raised his hand. "What about compensation? Most of us have been here over 10 years. Harrison Industries is prepared to offer fair relocation assistance," Margaret replied smoothly. "Each family will receive $3,000 to help with moving expenses and deposits on new housing." The room erupted in angry voices. $3,000 wouldn't cover first month's rent in most places, let alone security deposits and moving costs. "What about our community?" shouted Mrs. Rodriguez from Trailer 23. "My grandchildren live here. This is our home." "I understand this is difficult," Margaret said, her voice professionally sympathetic. "But progress requires sacrifice. The Harrison luxury condominiums will bring jobs and tax revenue to the area." Grace felt sick. Luxury condominiums where families like hers would never be able to afford even to visit, let alone live. Emma tugged on her sleeve. "Mama, why is everyone angry?" "Because sometimes rich people take things away from poor people," Grace whispered, surprised by the bitterness in her own voice. Margaret was explaining timelines and legal requirements when Emma suddenly gasped. "Mama, look!" Grace followed her daughter's pointing finger to a framed photograph on the display table. A groundbreaking ceremony photo featuring the Harrison Industries executive team. And there, in the center, shaking hands with the mayor and holding a golden shovel, was Robert. The caption read, "Harrison Industries CEO Robert Harrison breaks ground on the Riverside shopping complex." Grace's world tilted sideways. Robert Harrison, CEO of Harrison Industries, the man who had held her crying daughter, who had paid for Emma's medical bills, who had sat at their humble dinner table and told them about losing his daughter, the man who was stealing their home. "That's Robert," Emma said loudly, pointing at the photo. "That's our Robert." Several people turned to look, including Margaret Chen, whose eyes widened with recognition as she spotted Grace. "You know Mr. Harrison?" Margaret asked. Grace couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating that she felt physically ill. "He's our friend," Emma announced proudly, oblivious to her mother's shock. "He comes to dinner and takes care of us when I'm sick." Margaret's expression shifted from professional courtesy to genuine concern. "Ma'am, I think there might be some confusion." "No confusion," Grace managed to say, her voice hollow. "We know exactly who Robert Harrison is." As Margaret continued her presentation, Grace's mind raced through every interaction, every kindness, every moment of growing trust. Had it all been calculated? Had Robert been studying them, learning their weaknesses, preparing to minimize their resistance to his development project? The medical bills he'd paid, the scholarship fund he'd mentioned, the careful questions about where they'd go if they had to move. It all made horrible sense now. When the meeting ended, Grace gathered her papers and helped Emma with her coat, moving like a woman in a trance. Outside, the night air was sharp and cold, matching the ice that had formed around her heart. "Mama, why didn't Robert come to the meeting?" Emma asked as they walked home. "He would have told those people not to take our house away." Grace stopped walking and knelt in front of her daughter, taking Emma's small face in her hands. "Baby, I need you to understand something very important. Robert isn't who we thought he was. He's the man who's taking our house away." Emma's eyes filled with confusion and tears. "But he loves us. He told me so." "Sometimes people say things they don't mean," Grace whispered, her own tears falling now. "Sometimes people pretend to care about us when they really just want to hurt us." As they walked the remaining distance to Trailer 47, Grace felt something precious and irreplaceable shatter inside her chest. She'd been foolish to believe that a man like Robert could genuinely care about people like them. She'd let herself hope, let Emma hope, and now they would both pay the price for her naivety. Emma cried herself to sleep that night, asking why Robert had lied to them. Grace sat beside her daughter's bed, staring at the crayon drawing Emma had, made of their family, 3 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. Tomorrow, she would have to start looking for a new place to live. Tomorrow, she would have to figure out how to rebuild their life again. But tonight, she mourned the death of a dream she'd been foolish enough to believe could come true. Robert sat in his study at 3 a.m., surrounded by legal documents, financial projections, and architectural plans. He'd been awake for 36 hours straight, desperately searching for a solution that would satisfy his board, protect his company, and save the community that had become his lifeline. The math was brutal. Canceling the Sunset Project would cost Harrison Industries $47 million in committed funds, legal penalties, and lost revenue. The alternative sites he'd investigated would reduce profit margins by 60% and delay construction by at least 2 years. His phone had been ringing constantly. Board members demanding explanations, investors threatening lawsuits, employees worried about their jobs. Victoria Sterling had left 3 voicemails, each more urgent than the last, but none of that compared to the message that had shattered his heart completely. Grace's voice, recorded at 11:47 p.m., was cold and precise. "Mr. Harrison, I want you to know that Emma and I will be out of Sunset Trailer Park by February 15th. We don't want your relocation money, and we don't want your help finding a new place. We'll manage on our own, like we always have. And if you ever truly cared about Emma, you'll stay away from us. Some damage can't be undone." The line had gone dead, leaving Robert alone with the devastating finality of her words. He'd lost them, the only people who had made his life worth living since Sarah's death were gone, and it was entirely his fault. Robert walked to the window, overlooking his estate's manicured grounds. Somewhere across the city, Emma was probably sleeping fitfully, confused and heartbroken by the betrayal of someone she'd trusted completely. Grace was likely lying awake, planning their uncertain future and cursing herself for believing in him. His reflection stared back from the dark glass, a man who had everything money could buy and nothing that actually mattered. The irony was devastating. He'd built Harrison Industries to create a legacy for Sarah, to ensure she'd never want for anything. But Sarah was gone, and in trying to honor her memory through corporate success, he'd become the very thing she would have despised, someone who destroyed families to build empires. A soft knock on the study door interrupted his thoughts. Margaret entered, carrying a steaming cup of coffee and a concerned expression. "Sir, you need to get some sleep. The emergency board meeting is in 6 hours." "Cancel it," Robert said quietly. "Sir, cancel the meeting. Cancel the project. Cancel everything." Margaret's eyes widened. "Robert, if you cancel Sunset now, the board will call for a vote of no confidence. You could lose control of your own company." "Maybe I should." "You don't mean that." Robert turned from the window to face his longtime assistant. "Margaret, in 15 years of working together, have you ever seen me truly happy?" She hesitated. "You were happy when Sarah was born, and when she took her first steps, when she played piano. And since the accident," Margaret's expression softened. "You've been surviving, not living." For 3 weeks, I was living again. A little girl with duct tape shoes and a $5 allowance showed me what wealth really means, and I destroyed it because I was too much of a coward to choose love over profit. Robert walked to his desk and pulled out a sheet of paper. Draft my resignation letter, effective immediately, and schedule a press conference for tomorrow afternoon. Robert, you can't. I can and I will. Robert's voice was firm, decided. Harrison Industries will proceed with the Sunset development under new leadership. The board will get their profits, the investors will get their returns, and 47 families will lose their homes. But I won't be the one holding the demolition orders. Margaret stared at him. What will you do? Robert picked up Emma's crayon drawing from his desk, the one she'd given him at the hospital, showing their little family under a rainbow. He'd carried it with him every day since. I don't know, he admitted, but for the first time in months, I'm going to try to do the right thing, even if it costs me everything. As dawn broke over the city, Robert began writing the most important letter of his life, not his resignation, that would come later. This letter was for Grace and Emma, an apology that would probably never be read but needed to be written. He had less than 48 hours before the board meeting that would determine the fate of Sunset Trailer Park. 48 hours to find a miracle that could save the community without destroying the company hundreds of employees depended on. It seemed impossible. But then again, a few weeks ago, he'd thought it was impossible for an 8-year-old girl to teach a broken billionaire how to love again. Sometimes the impossible was just another word for what we're not brave enough to try. The Harrison Industries boardroom had never witnessed anything like what unfolded on that cold February morning. Robert walked in carrying a single manila folder and Emma's crayon drawing, his face calm, despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. 12 board members sat around the mahogany table, their expressions ranging from concerned to openly hostile. Victoria Sterling spoke first. Robert, we've been patient with your grief, but this company cannot survive your recent decisions. The Sunset Project is worth $47 million. Robert interrupted quietly. I know the numbers, Victoria. I also know something more valuable. He placed Emma's drawing on the table. 3 stick figures under a rainbow, drawn with broken crayons on dollar store paper. This was given to me by an 8-year-old girl who spent her entire allowance to buy lunch for a broken stranger. She taught me that the measure of wealth isn't what you accumulate, but what you're willing to give away. Charles Whitfield leaned forward aggressively. Robert, with all due respect for your personal situation, we have fiduciary responsibilities. Yes, we do. Robert opened his folder and pulled out a cashier's check. Harrison Industries will proceed with the Sunset development as planned. This check covers the full amount of my personal shares in the company, $47 million. Consider it my final contribution. The room erupted in shocked voices, but Robert continued calmly. I'm resigning as CEO, effective immediately. Victoria, you have my recommendation for succession. The company will be more profitable than ever, and I won't be there to interfere with your progress. Robert, you can't be serious, Margaret whispered. This company is your life's work. No, Robert said softly, looking at Emma's drawing. This company was my attempt to build a legacy for my daughter. But Sarah's real legacy isn't in board, meetings and profit margins. It's in the kindness she showed every person she met. Just like another little girl I know. Victoria's voice was gentle now, concerned. What will you do? Robert smiled for the first time in weeks. I'm going to invest in something that actually matters. 3 hours later, Robert stood outside Murphy's diner, his heart pounding as he watched Grace work through the window. She moved efficiently between tables, but her usual warmth was gone, replaced by the mechanical motions of someone going through the motions of living. Emma sat in their corner booth, coloring listlessly. Even from outside, Robert could see that Her usual joy had dimmed. He pushed open the door, and conversation stopped. Grace looked up from her order pad, her face cycling through surprise, anger, and something that might have been pain. "We're closed to you," she said coldly. "Grace, please, 5 minutes." "Mama, it's Robert." Emma's voice cracked with hope and confusion. "Did you come to fix everything?" Robert knelt beside Emma's booth, his eyes level with hers. "Emma, I need to tell you something very important. I made terrible mistakes, and I hurt you and your mama. I'm sorry." "Are you still going to take our house?" Emma asked, her eyes wide and trusting despite everything. "No, sweetheart, your house is safe. All the houses are safe." Grace moved closer, suspicion clear in her voice. "What are you talking about?" Robert stood slowly, pulling a set of legal documents from his jacket. "I bought Sunset Trailer Park this morning. All of it. It's yours now, the whole community. No rent, no landlords, no developers. It belongs to the families who live there." Grace stared at the deed, her hands trembling. "This is impossible. You can't just—" "I can, and I did. Harrison Industries will build their condominium somewhere else. I made sure of it. With what money?" Grace's voice was barely a whisper. "Robert, what did you do?" "I liquidated my shares in the company, sold my mansion, converted everything. Liquid into a community trust fund that will maintain the park, pay property taxes, and provide college scholarships for every child who lives there." Emma's eyes were wide with wonder. "You gave away all your money for us." "Not gave away, sweetheart. Invested in the most important thing I've ever found." Grace was crying now, the legal documents shaking in her hands. "Robert, you didn't have to destroy your life for us." "I didn't destroy it," Robert said softly. "I finally started living it. Grace, I know I broke your trust. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But I want you to know that every moment we shared was real. Emma saved my life that day in the diner, and you both taught me what family actually means." Emma launched herself into Robert's arms, holding him tight. "Are you going to live with us now? In a trailer?" Robert looked over Emma's head at Grace, whose tears were falling freely now. "Only if your mama thinks there's room for a foolish old man who finally learned what matters most." Grace wiped her eyes, studying his face. "What about your company, your legacy?" "My legacy is making sure Emma grows up in a world where kindness matters more than profit margins, where a little girl's $5 allowance can change someone's entire life." Grace was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached out and touched Robert's cheek. "Emma was right about you from the beginning. She said you just needed someone to remember you were special." "Do you think—" Robert's voice broke slightly. "Do you think there's a chance we could be a real family? Not just pretend," Emma answered, before Grace could speak. "We already are a family, silly. I drew the picture, remember?" Grace laughed through her tears, the sound like music after weeks of silence. "I remember. 3 people under a rainbow." That evening, as the sun set over Sunset Trailer Park, now officially renamed Emma's Community in honor of the little girl whose kindness had started it all, Robert sat on the porch of his new home. It was a small trailer, barely a tenth the size of his former mansion, but it felt like the most luxurious place on earth. Grace worked in her garden while Emma played on the swing set, her laughter carrying on the evening breeze. In his pocket, Robert carried 2 things: Emma's original crayon drawing and a small velvet box containing an engagement ring he hoped to give Grace when the time was right. 6 months later, at their wedding in the community center, Emma served as both flower girl and best man, proudly announcing to everyone that her daddy Robert had taught her the most important lesson of all. The richest people are the ones who give away the most love. Robert Harrison had lost a fortune and gained everything that mattered, and every night, as he tucked Emma into bed and kissed Grace goodnight, he whispered a thank you to Sarah's memory for sending him an angel in duct-taped shoes who showed him the way home, In a world that often seemed to value wealth over kindness, one 8-year-old girl had proven that the smallest acts of love could change everything. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, they give you a second chance at the life you were always meant to live.